All right. As rec trail applicants for the federal highway funding, your agency must understand the requirements for the National Environmental Policy Act, just like Pete just mentioned earlier. So in this session, we will talk about NEPA and how FDOT process that you're going to need to follow to demonstrate and document compliance with NEPA. So what is NEPA? It is the National Environmental Policy Act that established a national policy for protection of the environment and to raise awareness of the importance of natural resources. NEPA was signed into law on January 1st, 1970, and requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of their proposed actions prior to making decisions. NEPA is sometimes referred to as an umbrella, as compliance with NEPA requires compliance with other environmental laws such as the Clean Water Act, National Historic Preservation Act, and the Endangered Species Act, just to name a few. All federal agencies are subject to NEPA. The Federal Highway Administration assigned NEPA responsibilities to FDOT back in December of 2016. So therefore, the FDOT is now responsible for all environmental regulations for highway projects, and it also includes NEPA responsibility for recreational trail documents that are managed by FDEP. The Project Development and Environment, or PD&E Manual, provides procedures on how the department complies with NEPA and other laws, executive orders, and regulations. It provides guidance on how to determine a project's class of action and how to conduct appropriate analysis to demonstrate environmental compliance. Following the manual will ensure compliance with NEPA and other laws, executive orders, and regulations. The PD&E Manual comes in two parts. Part 1 details the process and documentation, and Part 2 details specific topics and how they should be analyzed. I'm going to send your attention to Part 1, Chapter 2 of the manual, which is the class of action determination for federal projects. Here you will find information on how to determine the level of environmental document you will need to satisfy NEPA. There are 3 classes of action for federal projects, as shown on the bottom of this slide. The class of action is dependent upon whether the project will have significant impacts. Projects with significant impacts require the development of an environmental impact statement, or EIS. Projects with a question of significance requires the development of an environmental assessment, or EA. And projects with no significant impacts are categorically excluded from the development of an EA or EIS. In many cases, the determination of significance will be obvious because the absence of resources or because the proposed action does not impact resources. In other cases, the degree to which the project may affect a resource will need to be considered closely. In Florida, we have a Type 1 and Type 2 categorical exclusions. The Type 1 categorical exclusions are listed in 23 CFR 771C or D. Common Type 1 CEs that we use are C3, which is the construction of bicycle and pedestrian lanes, paths, and facilities, C7 for landscaping, C9 for emergency repairs, and the rest are listed in the CFR as well as in Part 1, Chapter 2 of the manual. But the summary of all of this is that all categorical exclusions must not have significant impacts. But, and basically recreational trails will typically be a Type 1 CE, and a C3 would most likely be the appropriate C type for your project, which is the construction of bicycle and pedestrian lanes, paths, and facilities. So in the previous slide, I mentioned that the level of documentation is determined on whether the project impacts on resources are significant. But how is significance determined? The determination as to whether a project has significant impacts is made for a variety of resources. These are just some of them. The full list of resources are found in the PD&E manual. For example, if you wanted information on how wetlands are addressed, you can look in Part 2, Chapter 9 of the PD&E manual. Impacts to species are found in Part 2, Chapter 16, and impacts to contamination are found in Part 2, Chapter 20. And I highlight those because those are some of the things that you're going to need to analyze as part of your Type 1 CE. So to illustrate how significance is determined, let's look at this example. Currently, my teenagers are enrolled in online school with a local high school. The teacher who is in the classroom instructs both students in the classroom and those online. Reliable internet is required for the teacher to teach students who are at home. So if the internet goes out at my house, only my student is impacted. Is that a significant impact? No, probably not. Because the class, the teacher can still instruct the rest of the class. My student is just going to have to do some catch-up work later. But if the internet goes out for the entire region and all online students cannot attend the class, there may be a question of significance. But we need to look a little bit further. How many students are online versus in class? We will probably need to look a bit closer at that to determine the significance. And in the scenario, what if the teacher gets sick? Is that a significant impact? It definitely could be, because the teacher could be the only one certified to teach that particular class. But then again, the principal might step in and say, hey, we have another qualified substitute teacher to teach the class, and then you don't have a significant impact anymore. So if we look at this classroom scenario where one student loses internet connection, that would not be a significant impact, and a categorical exclusion is appropriate. Where the internet is out in the entire area, there is a question of significance, and an environmental assessment would be appropriate. And where the teacher gets sick and cannot teach, that could be a significant impact, where an environmental impact statement would be warranted. And granted, this is just an example to illustrate how we talk about looking at a particular resource, looking at a particular project to determine how our project's impacts would be the resource and how significance would be determined. Okay. So, but historically, I think most of the recreational trail projects have been documented as categorical exclusions, meaning that these projects, based on past experience with similar actions, have not individually or cumulatively have had a significant environmental effect, and therefore is excluded from the requirements to prepare an EA or an EIS. In addition, in order to be a categorical exclusion, the project must not involve significant environmental impacts, induce significant impacts to planned growth or land use for the area, require the relocation of significant numbers of people, have significant impact on any natural, cultural, recreational, historic, or other resource, involve significant air, noise, or water quality impacts, have significant impacts on travel patterns, or otherwise either individually or cumulatively have any significant environmental impacts. The Type 1 CE determination is made by using the Type 1 CE checklist in the statewide environmental project tracker, also known as SWEP. The checklist is completed to determine if the project meets the CE criteria in the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. If the project does not meet the checklist criteria, coordination with DEP and OEM, which is our office, must occur. This may require screening in the environmental screening tool, completing a technical study to assess the impact to particular resources, coordination with resource agency or the public, and the preparation of a higher document level, typically a Type 2 categorical exclusion. Type 2 categorical exclusions are also reviewed and approved by our office, but we anticipate most FDEP projects meeting the requirements to be a Type 1 CE. There are 30 C-listed categorical exclusions in 23 CFR 771, but C3, as I mentioned earlier, will typically be used for the construction of bicycle and pedestrian lanes, paths, and facilities. So this is typically the one that's going to be used for DEP rec trail projects. So let's walk through some of the information that you're going to need to create for Type 1 CE. And what I've done through the next series of slides is actually pulled screenshots of the SWEP tool so we can kind of walk through what's going to be required. First, for FDEP rec trail projects, there is one assigned FM number, which is 404-189-1-A8. And the last two digits are going to be identified for year. And so I believe for 2018, it was 25. The 2019 project should be 26. And as we move forward with future years, it will just advance from there. Because the same FM is used for all FDEP rec trail projects, it is important to add identifiers when creating your Type 1 CE form. For example, you can add in project name and the county. All the other fields are pre-populated in the system. At the bottom of the screen, you will also indicate whether this is a local agency program. This response should be no, because this is for the local agency program, also known as LAP, which is funded under a different source and not the Recreational Trails Program. You are also going to be asked to select the appropriate CE type. You can have either C or D, but we think most of these should be the C3 category. And in the box that you can see, I've already selected C3, but all the other categorical exclusion types will be listed. You're also going to need to add in the project description. The project description must be written to allow a person without prior knowledge of the project to clearly understand what the project is. The project description must include the following information: a brief description of the existing facility, the limits of the proposed project, such as the length and logical termini, which is the beginning and the end of the project, the names of the city and the county where the project is located, a brief description of the proposed improvements, a brief description of the pedestrian and bicycle accommodation, navigational needs, if any, and a project location map illustrating project limits. The map should display any landmarks mentioned in describing the proposed project action, such as cities, towns, rivers, and other resources in the project area. And for more information on an appropriate project description, please refer to Part 2, Chapter 1, Project Description and Purpose and Need. Next, you must verify that the project meets the constraints of 23 CFR 771.117, which is specifically saying that the project will not induce significant impacts to planned growth or land use for the area, travel patterns, involve significant air or water quality impacts, or cause substantial controversy on environmental grounds. You do this by selecting the box next to the verified box right there. And as mentioned earlier, projects that are being documented as a categorical exclusion must not have any significant impacts. The first question that you're going to answer is the right-of-way question. So will the project require property acquisition? Typically, only minor right-of-way acquisitions are allowable for Type 1 CEs. Any right-of-way required will need to be detailed in the comment box provided. Will the project require any relocations? When relocations are anticipated for a project, information regarding residences, businesses, and institutional community facilities that may be relocated will need to be summarized. If the project requires a relocation, please work with FDEP and also our office, and we will probably need to discuss. Most of our projects we anticipate will not be requiring any relocations. More information on relocations can be found in Part 2, Chapter 4 of the PD&E manual. You will need to include information on wetlands and understand the federal permit type your project will be required to obtain. Detail wetland impacts in the space provided and include permit authorization that will be required. Trail projects would typically qualify under Nationwide Permit Type 3, which is the maintenance nationwide permit, where you can repair, rehabilitate, or replace previously authorized current serviceable structures or fills. Nationwide 23 might also be appropriate, which is approved category exclusions, and also Nationwide 42 recreational facilities. You will need to contact your core permitting office representative to ensure that the appropriate permit type will be obtained for your project. For more information about wetlands, refer to Part 2, Chapter 9, and another resource is Part 1, Chapter 12, Environmental Permitting. Both are in the PD&E manual. You will also need to know if there's going to be a Coast Guard bridge permit required. If you have a project that's going to require a Coast Guard bridge permit, please contact us. We'll need to consider whether a Type 1 CE is the appropriate class of action for this project. For floodplains, protection of floodplains and floodways is required by Executive Order 11988, Floodplain Management. The intent of these regulations is to avoid or minimize highway and land use development encroachments that reduce storage and increase water surface elevations within base floodplains. Where encroachment is unavoidable, the regulations require FDOT to take appropriate measures to minimize or mitigate impacts. Further guidance can be found in the Executive Order 11988 and also can be found in guidelines for implementing Executive Order 11988 floodplain management. You can also look at Part 2, Chapter 13, floodplains for more information. FDEP recreational trails should more than likely select no floodplain present, no floodplain impact, or functionally dependent use or facilities open space use. Next, you're going to have to determine whether there is involvement with wild and scenic river or study river. You're going to need to refer to Part 2, Chapter 12, Wild and Scenic Rivers for more information. But as we talk about this today, the only wild and scenic rivers or study rivers in Florida are the Loxahatchee, St. Mary's, and Myakka River. If your project is within the limits listed in this section, you will need to call our office before you can complete this form. You will also need to determine whether your project will have impacts or involve a river on the nationwide rivers inventory. Note that there is a link in the SWEP tool for the NRI interactive map, and you can use that to determine whether your project is in an area of on the nationwide rivers inventory. If you have an adverse effect, you cannot process this as a type 1 CE. You will also need to understand how your project impacts protected species and essential fish habitat. You're going to provide a list of potential species that may occur in the action area. Lists can be obtained by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service. You can also use the environmental screening tool or a tool called Information for Planning and Consultation, which is called IPAC, or other service provided sources for federally listed species. A ranking of probability occurrence along with a definition of those probabilities should also be provided. The service's online species list, available data sources, current literature, and species specialists may also be consulted to help identify what federally listed species may be in the project area. Include species and critical habitats proposed for federal listing, as well as federal candidate species on the list. Federally designated critical habitat within the action area also needs to be identified. FHWA projects require documentation of compliance with the Endangered Species Act and the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation Act, kind of like I mentioned in the previous slide. A species evaluation is required for all environmental documents in accordance with FHWA's 2002 memorandum titled Management of Endangered Species Act, Environmental Analysis and Consultation Process. If there are no listed species in the action area, then an explanation outlining the methodology used to make that conclusion must be provided. This is also the same if there are no EFH in the project area. If there are listed species present and no consultation is required, select the second option. If consultation is required, select option C. And I'd also like to add that if you require consultation, you're going to need to prepare documentation for our review, and as the lead agency, we will help make sure you complete consultation for protected species and essential fish habitat. All right, and so this one is also, so in the area where you have ESA listed species and or essential fish habitat present, you have the option to determine whether there's no effect, or you can use consultation keys, and that completes your consultation requirements for EFH and ESA. And if you choose those options, you will provide the description of what occurred in the comment box in this particular section. If you have consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries, You have the option of may affect, not likely to adversely affect, where you're going to be attaching the concurrence letter. And then if you have may affect, likely to adversely affect, you're going to need to be working with us because this might not necessarily be the appropriate class of action for your particular project, and we're going to need to talk further. If the project is located outside of areas where the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Act applies, an EFH assessment is not required and consultation with National Marine Fisheries is not required. And most FDEP projects hopefully fall into this category. Section 4F is the next question you're going to come up upon. Section 4 refers to the original section within the U.S. Department of Transportation Act of 1966, which provided for consideration of park and recreational lands, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and historic sites during transportation project development. The law applies to U.S. DOT and is implemented by the Federal Highway Administration. Section 4 properties include significant publicly owned public parks, recreation activities, and wildlife or waterfowl refuges, and any publicly or privately owned historic site listed or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. This statement, however, will be automatically populated in the Type 1 CE form. Since recreational trails are funded under the Federal Trails Program, they are exempt from review from Section 4 of the USD Act of 1966. Rec trails need to demonstrate compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And I will just show you what the options are here, but Roy's going to talk more specifically about Section 106 requirements in the presentation after this one. For most trail projects, this should be a no for noise analysis, and is not required as the proposed project is a Type 3 project. So this standard statement is going to be included, which states that the proposed project is a Type 3 project and does not require a noise analysis or consideration of abatement measures. Now, there might be some of those projects that have alternative, the vehicle, the rec trail project that allows recreational vehicles, and in that case, we'll probably need to have a discussion. So, but the majority of the projects should not be required. For contamination, include a brief summary of Level 1 evaluation in the Type 1 form. And you'll need to upload the Level 1 contamination report, tech memo, or contamination clearance letter, as well as documentation of subsequent assessment as appropriate in SWEPT. The Level 1 evaluation is performed to screen potentially contaminated sites that are within or adjacent to the project. The Level 1 evaluation does not involve sampling and testing soil or groundwater. The information obtained from the Level 1 evaluation should be sufficient enough to determine potential contamination risk on each project alternative. The Level 1 evaluation consists of desktop review of the proposed project scope of work, contamination-related records, site reconnaissance, field review, interviews, estimating risk ratings, and preparation of a report or technical memo. And please refer to Part 2, Chapter 20, and that talks more about contamination. For planning consistency, the supporting information should be uploaded is the project priority list, highlighting the subject project. Use the tip-step link to upload the appropriate planning consistency documents. And once you get all of that information loaded, eventually you'll get to this slide where you can save the draft or send the project for approval. The approval of the Type 1 CE is handled by our office. We will confirm that the files are complete and SWEPT and the appropriate information is included on the form to support the decision that the project is a Type 1 CE. This is just the cover page of what a type 1 CE looks like. Notice how each area that was discussed as a part of this presentation has a section on the form starting with the project details and continuing with resource summaries. And I know we went through this quite quickly, but I have to point out that lots of this information is available on our OEM website, including, of course, our PD&E manual, both parts 1 and part 2, as well as computer-based trainings on the different parts of part 1 and part 2 to help you navigate through the type 1 CE process as you are preparing your form. All right, and I think that is all I have.
Hi, Tu. We have a couple of questions from Mira. The first one is, how are we supposed to know if consultation is required for endangered species?
Well, that's going to depend on, you're going to have an understanding of what is in your project area. And if you recall, I had mentioned a few tools that you can use to see first what species are listed in your project area, and then how to determine what impacts that your project is going to have on those particular species. We do have species keys that are available that you can get to, you know, a no effect or may affect, not likely to adversely affect. But for certain species, if you end up with a may affect, not likely to adversely affect, you still need to get concurrence from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. So hopefully for your particular project, you're going to be working with qualified consultants, biologists that can help you get to that answer. And then we can be here to help support that as well.
Thank you, Tu. The second question from Mira is a level 1 required of all projects, even if we think there is no contamination consideration?
If you have documentation that there is no contamination in your area, the appropriate documentation should be in the file to support that. But the level 1 should be something fairly simple to complete. And I can go back to that slide real quick, hopefully, about what is required for contamination. So let's see. I mean, you're going to have something to put in the file to confirm that there is no contamination in the project area. And I think when we were talking to internally, typically a level 1 is the appropriate documentation. But if you have particular scenarios that you want to run through with us, we can talk on a project by project basis as well.
Thank you, Tu. We have a couple of questions from Katie. The first one is, can you repeat the resources for determining species present at the project site?
Okay, let's see. Get back to that slide. Hold on, I'm just trying to find, okay. So the resources, you can reach out to, of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have the ability to help you determine what species are in your project area, but you will also have access to the environmental screening tool, which has some of that information. And then also the one that can be very useful for you is called the Information for Planning and Consultation, which is called IPAC. That is something that is used by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So definitely reach out to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and they can help you make sure you have the appropriate list for your project area.
Thank you. The second question from Katie is, would invasive treatment by licensed pesticide applicator be considered a substantial controversy on environmental grounds?
I have not seen that as something as rising to the level of controversy, but maybe, Katasha, have you heard of something like that for, you know, removing exotics or invasive species? I don't think so, but, you know, that has not come across for me.
Yeah, for me either. In my experience, that would normally not be a controversial issue.
Thanks, Katasha.
Thank y'all. Let's see. All right, next question is from Mira. Last year, July 2019, we were asked to provide much of this documentation relating to NEPA. Do you already have this documentation, or will we need to resubmit it?
I think that question is probably more appropriate for DEP. As of this point, DOT does not have any information that is at a place where we can review and approve. So the application process runs through DEP first, and then the projects are prioritized, and then the completed document is sent to OEM at FDOT for review and approval. As of today, we don't have anything that is ready for review and approval at FDOT.
Thank you. The next question is from Julie, and she would like to know if documents are missing after submitting, will your office notify the grantees and give a chance to fix any omissions or errors?
Definitely, there's going to have to be close coordination between the grantee, DEP, and OEM. We certainly will not be able to approve any document without the appropriate documentation. So there will have to be communication, whether it's directly from our office here or we go through the DEP office to work with you as the grantee. So definitely there should be an opportunity to make sure any missing documentation is included before we complete our review, and we will not be approving anything with incomplete information.
Thank you. The next question is from Julie as well. If the grantee is a biologist or wetland scientist, is this a qualifying profession to complete the protected species and essential fish habitat section?
Yes.
Thank you. A follow-up to one of Katie's previous questions is, so we don't have to complete NEPA documentation unless our project is prioritized by DEP after application submission.
That is correct. So DEP has their prioritization process, and at that point, the grantees will be notified and then also given access to SWEPT. And then at that point, you will be creating the Type 1 CE using SWEPT and moving forward to getting your NEPA document approved.